So Evan Liberman, my good friend of many years, we're not going to mention how many years. Once you get to a certain age, you don't say how many years you've known somebody, right?
Right. Decades.
So yeah, and you started and have built Wise Money, which helps people invest in Israeli securities. I understand that today you have 170 million shekels under management, more or less. You told me you have investors from over 26 countries.
Right.
I think many of them are already members of the Arise Alliance, members of our community. And I do have to say that every time I've referred somebody to you, for you to help them invest in Israeli stocks and bonds, they've come back and raved about your services. So, and they've said, wow, Evan's great. He gives us services at an American level, you know, which as an Israeli is kind of like maybe a backhanded compliment. They're like, what, you come to the Middle East and you expect everybody to do work in a schlocky way? Well, you know, you're a very serious professional, you give good reporting, and people are happy with the results. So more power to you on Wise Money. Now, we want to talk today about the Israeli stock market, stocks and bonds, and if you could just help us think at a macro level right now, and the recent current events over the last year, how that's affected the Israeli market, and what are some of kind of the big headlines before we jump into more nitty-gritty?
Sure. Well, first of all, Calev, thanks for having me here and talking about the Israeli market. I'm passionate about what's going on here, of course, in Israel. I think that some of the innovations that are happening in the last decades are really amazing. I want to talk a little bit about the market. The market, of course, in the capital market of the publicly traded securities is done on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And as you know, it's our single one market here, exchange of both stocks and bonds, exchange-traded funds, mutual funds. It's all done through the market in Tel Aviv, but it services not only the Israeli public, but also investors from abroad, and anyone can involve themselves in the market. Securities in Israel actually have been traded here since 1935. Even before the state was formed, people are already interested in getting a hold of what's going on in Israel.
That makes sense, by the way, that the Jewish state would start with the stock market and then actually declare independence.
Exactly. So getting things started economically, of course, was very important. The stock market can really be a major driver to an economy. So the market is made up of about 23 member firms, which are banks and brokerages, both Israeli banks and foreign banks and brokerages, and the Bank of Israel, and they trade between themselves based on accounts that are held. So hundreds of thousands of accounts are trading through those member firms. What we see is that it's, of course, strictly regulated by the Israel Securities Authority, where I hold my license. And the market is made up, as I said, of about 3,600 different securities. Obviously, we have about 500-600 different companies here that are listing their stocks, but listing their bonds, corporate bonds, government bonds, options, exchange-traded funds. Whatever you want to get here, basically, you can get.
But if I understand Wise Money and what you do,
yeah.
you also invest in a small amount of Israeli companies that have done IPOs on NASDAQ as well, right? Not just
That's true. Our focus, of course, as a Zionistic firm, is to focus on Israeli securities wherever they're found. So some companies, of course, whether they be startups or smaller companies, want to list in a larger market, and so they'll go to, let's say, NASDAQ in the United States. We'll still track them there. We have a filter that looks through all the companies in the world that are Israeli-based, Israeli-headquartered firms, and we're able to invest also in foreign markets. Definitely, those are interesting companies. Most of those are obviously tech companies, which we're really excited about those as well. And so the market here, though, is denominated, at least in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange companies, in the shekel, which is a strong currency. We'll get into that a little bit later, hopefully. The market value is about $700 billion worth, of course, in shekels, which is definitely a decent size for a small country like our own. Right. Traded securities are about $2 billion worth every day, so it's a very liquid market. It's traded Sunday through Thursday because of our Shabbat coming, of course, in a different day. There are sectors that you can involve yourself in, from technology, biomed, industry, high-tech, biomed companies, for example, real estate, basically the gamut of securities that you'd find in energy and these sorts of things that you'd find in any developed market. We are considered a developed market by S&P and the large index makers around the world, and yet our GDP is still very high comparative. So we're like an emerging market economy, but already declared a developed world, so to speak.
So it's like the best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds. You're seeing good growth, but still we're small and innovative. So basically, accounts that are opened on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange or with one of the remote members are individual accounts, but they can also be joint accounts, husband, wife, father, son, that sort of thing, mother, daughter. Partnerships, LLCs, companies, nonprofit organizations, and even retirement accounts. So that's an interesting way if you have funds that you want to put to deploy. You don't have to just deploy them in your home market. You can deploy them also in Israeli
So
securities.
there's broad access. There's a broad funnel of people who want to invest in Israeli companies.
Exactly.
If we're looking at 2022, okay, in light of the recent developments, current events in the Middle East, what do you see as exciting things to look at as investors, as somebody who's responsible for managing investment in the emerging, exciting Israeli companies that publicly traded?
All right, so what we have is a number of interesting trends that have been for the last number of years, and I can address a few of those, and also look at what's the possible trends of the future. What are we seeing out there in the next few years? So the current trends that have been going on from Israelis' innovation is basically in the alternate energy space. There's a lot of companies, publicly and traded, and also startups in alternate energies such as wind technology, solar technology, thermal energy, renewable energies essentially. That's the trend of a lot of the Israeli tech companies that are coming public in the last number of years. We're a leader country in that space. But we're also leading in pioneering the space of cybersecurity. There's a lot of companies that are solving some of the world's cyber terrorism issues in that space. In fact, 41% of global funding that goes to cyber companies is actually going to Israeli companies. So almost half the market of cyber is through us. And if we look at what are called unicorns, you're familiar, of course, with the startup world here in Israel, but it's rare that you have a company that's a startup that makes its way to $1 billion while still private. So those unicorn companies, if you look in the cyberspace specifically, 1 out of every 3 of those cyber unicorns are Israeli, and so we're just a major leader in this space. So I would say that trend is a continuing, ongoing trend as Israel's had to go through its own security issues and having to guard our own infrastructure from cyber terrorism. We've developed solutions and we're externalizing that technology to the world.
Let's talk for a moment about the Israeli security issues. People might be a little bit, I think there's a psychological hurdle in putting money in a foreign market and thoughts about security concerns. And what would you say if we look at the Abraham Accords, for instance, which took place a little bit over a year ago? How did that affect security concerns in the Israeli market? Do you feel more confident today advising international investors to put their well-earned money here because of current events? How do you look at that?
So actually, the Abraham Accords is one of the items actually in the current events that has really helped Israel politically on the world stage become much more of a secure place to invest their funds. Obviously, back in August, Israel made these peace deals with a number of the Muslim states and basically said, we're open for business, anyone who wants to do business with us. And until now, it's been a very few amount of Muslim states that are willing to, of course, do business with us. But now we started to see a wave starting into 2020 of companies like Bahrain and UAE and others that are actually forming partnerships with Israel, both on the government level, on entrepreneurs, partnerships, even some of the public traded firms and banks are already doing agreements between their various organizations. So we'll start to see the fruit of that, of course, in the future years in the securities market, but we're already seeing a general sense of the political risk of Israel has dropped. It's much more politically a good space to invest in. So we're definitely seeing that. One of the other things, of course, that shaped our market in the last year and a half or so has been COVID. Now, Israel's gross domestic product had been very high until COVID. In fact, an envy of many of the other OECD nations of developed markets. And we've been seeing 3-4% year over year for about the last 2 decades. So of course, COVID took that down like it did all the rest of the nations. Our GDP, of course, contracted in the COVID year of 2020, but nothing beyond what the other countries of the world had done. We're about 3.7% contraction, which is what the United States was at. But our stock market, of course, took a hit at the same time. But recovered after the initial hit of March and February of last year. And it took us about 11 months to crawl out of the economic damage that was done to the market. But after 11 months, those investors that had the fortitude to hang on actually made money. We made money for our clients during the COVID year just by timing when we were going to buy and sell things. And so in 14% beyond the initial COVID, pre-COVID levels, we've seen recovery since then as well. So COVID is behind us now. We're seeing the contraction is now turning into growth again. Israel's come back to about a 4% growth rate, a 5% unemployment rate. So we're back in business is from that perspective. And one of the things that's really interesting is looking at where that growth is coming from. A lot of the growth in our market is actually in the large cap stocks. So we're not looking actually now at the small cap necessarily being the major growers. In the last 12 months, we see the Tel Aviv market has grown the large cap index by 38%. And that's even outstripped some of the other markets in the world, like Wall Street at 32%. So just some of these companies that are just steady, banks, some technologies, of course, in there, but pharmaceuticals, these companies are really rebounding well after the COVID crisis. If we look through the 125 companies and we start to go a little deeper, we see even a better picture of what's happening here. Actually, half of those companies have made 50% or more in their stock price just in the last 12 months.
Wow, that's
and
fantastic.
15% have actually made over 100%. Now, in my business, we're looking for steady growth. If we're making 10% a year, we're happy. We've been seeing tens of percent of growth, and even some companies that over a year or two are making hundreds of percent of growth. So it's an unusually good time to be in the Israeli market.
So I want to, coming back, you were talking about the way that the Abraham Accords have made Israel a more secure market to invest in, and to me, it almost sounds like a positive feedback loop. I remember I heard former Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu said in one of his speeches, he says there's 3 reasons that every country in the world will want to do business with Israel: technology, technology, technology. So the very fact that there's a trend of these countries moving their embassies to Jerusalem, which means they're, let's say, upgrading their diplomatic relations with Israel, and then actually signing on that you have these Arab states, which traditionally, 30, 40 years ago, were boycotting Israel. There's the Arab oil embargo, etc., which is the reason the embassies moved originally. Now they're saying, we want to do business. We want to be in relationships. So it seems that they need Israeli technology. You talked about cybersecurity, right, and the importance of that for Israel's diplomatic. So we want diplomatic relations, right, because of technology, but then that opens up the markets. Now they're putting their money here, which is even more of a reason to protect their relationship with Israel. So it sounds like a positive feedback loop. Yeah.
And to the extent that we see more and more economic growth of what's happening in Israel, and some of it based on these relationships that we're having with various countries, but just a country that has good economics, a country that's able to export technology. Ultimately, economics is what runs the world. Politics is definitely a part, and they've been able to isolate Israel for decades, but now we're such a powerhouse on the economic stage, and we have certain things that they need, so that certain initial countries are coming to really recognize what's going on here and make those initial steps, and yet it does feed back, because as we saw with the Abraham Accords, first it was one nation, and then it's just a snowball effect of other nations want to follow.
Yeah, I love it. It reminds me of something that our former Prime Minister and President, Shimon Peres, he was in politics for probably 50 years of his life. May his memory be blessed. He said, the politicians make problems, the business people find solutions. Right. And I think many people in the Arise community would identify with that. How business is leading really in the effort, successful effort in creating better diplomatic relations for Israel.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
So getting back to the Israeli stock market, what are some of the bigger points of why an international investor that doesn't have their money in Israeli securities, Israeli stocks and bonds right now, why that should interest them? Why they should start thinking about putting some of their portfolio in Israeli companies?
Really good question. I get asked this a lot, especially from investors that have never invested perhaps internationally in recognizing that diversification is really a major part of investing. We never know from whence the next crisis is going to hit, where it's going to hit harder, where can we protect our money. And so I'm encouraging investors to globally look at where they're going to put their investments. There's what's called a home bias, that people generally tend to want to invest in companies that they understand, in companies that they shop at, and they buy their shoes at. Right. And it is understandable. They want companies that are in their currency, in their market. Unfortunately, that doesn't globally diversify them enough. So a lot of managers, money managers globally, will look for maybe up to even a 30% allocation to international markets. some of the diversification that they would get by doing that would be, of course, currency. Now, if you're looking at Israel, the shekel happens to be one of the strongest currencies in the last number of years in the world. We're such a small economy, but it's doing so well that our shekel has been very strong. Not just in the last few years. A few years ago, Deutsche Bank actually declared Israel the second strongest currency in the world. But if you look even further back,
what was the first one? Do you know?
I believe it might have been the Australian dollar.
Okay,
I don't know if that's still the same place as strong a currency, but the shekel, if you look even over the last 2 decades compared to a basket of world currencies, or if we look at compared to the US dollar, the shekel has been stronger by 55%. Now, what does that mean? If someone had taken $100,000 and not even invested in Israel, but just put their money in the
just
shekel
converted
itself,
it to shekels.
just convert it to shekels. They would have had the value of 155,000 today without even investing, without even risking their funds. And so that's the strength of the shekel. You want to get diversified and have a currency hedge. Also, you want exposure to other companies besides your market's companies. Certain companies can only be found, for example, on the TASE. We've talked about Tel Aviv companies that list only here, so some of the technology names. You obviously want to have offshore investments for the potential that in the future there might be currency controls in the world. And so you want to diversify that way, not have all your eggs in one basket. And also, markets are different. They act differently in different crises or different times that the markets are doing really well. Certain economies will do better than others over time. In general, world crises like we saw with COVID will hit all markets. But even in COVID, we saw a difference of how the Israeli economy reacted, how the Israeli government reacted, of course. And so we went into the crisis, we locked down earlier, but we came out earlier. And so you want to diversify across different markets as well.
Is it safe to say that the Israeli shekel consistently outperforms other currencies around the world, and the Israeli stock exchange, the TASE, also consistently outperforms other markets? So if you're putting your money in shekels in the Israeli stock exchange, it's like a double whammy. I mean,
right.
You're going to see exponential growth of your net worth.
Exactly. So one of the things we see with our clients, we put out reports both in our local currency, so we see the effect of the investments that we're doing for them, and that's been good. But then when we also put out our reports in dollars, they get really understand how much their global worth is growing by investing not only in Israeli companies, but also investing in the shekel.
Amazing. So I'm an international business person. You've convinced me now I need to put some part of my investment portfolio into the Israeli stock exchange. How do I do that? And can I invest, for instance, my pension fund? Maybe it's my 401k or other investment vehicles that I have. Is it easy to take that and invest it into the Israeli market?
It's actually much easier than you would think to invest in the Israeli market. Most people don't know about this, and that's part of our job as a firm, is to get that word out there. There are ways to invest in brokerages, whether they be here or brokerages, for example, abroad, that have access to the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And so literally you can open your account in 20 minutes online and be able to convert currencies and trade in Israeli stocks very simply. And so the first thing, obviously, you do, open an account. You fund in a wire transfer. In certain countries, you can do a domestic wire online instantly. Then you convert your funds to shekels. You come up with an investment plan that's hopefully diversified across a number of different sectors. In quality companies, we generally look for 20 to 25 different Israeli companies to diversify in various sectors. And then you monitor your account over time. You watch the market. You try to see if there are shifts happening, when there are opportunities in the market. And we see opportunities pretty much every week or two to invest in some of the holdings that we like. We'll add more holdings to them. And in that way, we're lowering our cost basis and creating more of a profit for our portfolios.
And if they're investing through Wise Money, you're going to be sending them a report every so often. How often do they receive a report?
Right, they'll receive a report from us every quarter.
Okay.
They'll receive also from the brokerage firm itself reports, and they can go online anytime in English.
Every day.
Any day, middle of the day. As much as you want to see your investments, sometimes it's better actually
Which is usually
not
a bad
look
idea.
every day. Look in once a week, once a month, and you'll start to see that growth mounting up over time.
Yeah, fantastic. So if I'm thinking about investing in Israeli stocks and bonds, maybe I've already put my money in here and I want to stay up to date. What are some of those? Are there good websites or the resources out there where people can kind of track what's happening here before or after they've made a decision to invest in Israeli stocks and bonds?
That's a great question. We get asked that a lot. How do I keep up to date? I know what's happening in my portfolio, what's happening with the actual companies that I'm in the market that I'm investing in. So two answers. One, much of what goes on still in the Israeli market is done in Hebrew. And so if we're talking about quarterly reports, generally companies that are listed here will report in Hebrew. Of course, our firm, we're reading those reports in Hebrew, but also we see a trend now that the Israel Securities Authority and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange itself is recognizing the power of having international investors more in our market. It obviously gives us more liquidity. It encourages more companies to list on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And so there's been a big push over the last number of years to get a lot of that information out to international investors in English. So if you go to the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange website itself, you'll see more and more company reports in English. You'll see more news, investor relations sections very well developed there. So I would say start with the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. You can find out about any company that you want, any sector, performance, that sort of thing.
Right on their website.
Right on their website. There's Hebrew, there's English. Click on the English link and you'll see everything in English. There's also the Globe's magazine. That's also online and got a very well developed English side to their website. If you're looking for technology, you probably want to look at Calcalist Tech. That's a good site to look into the technology prowess of Israel and what's coming out there. Obviously, we have our website. Wise Money Israel's website is fully in English, and you can read about interesting investments, trends, companies that we're looking at and reviewing, and kind of get an inside look at what we're doing.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, the RISE community is all about doing well by doing good. So tackling some of the greatest crises facing humanity through Israeli innovation in a commercially viable way. And then it's a win-win-win, right? Because you're creating jobs, you're doing business, you're giving people a fishing rod and not just a fish, as our sages would say, and you're just helping a lot of people around the world. So this is not your investment consultation at the moment, right? But what are there certain stories or certain companies that you've been tracking and Wise Money has been investing in over the last year that are exciting, that are exciting stories, that are doing great things in innovation that you could say a few words about?
Sure. There's actually there's two companies that I'd like to focus on, actually, perhaps. Matronics is one. This is a company that's been around in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange for a number of decades. What they produce is pool cleaning robots. And so in this robotic space, Israel has a lot of experience. And so literally it's a robot that's controlled from your iPhone, and it goes and it cleans your pool automatically. And there's about 20-some million pools in the world that 3/4 of them are still actually cleaned non-robotically. And so there's a huge market that this Israeli company, which actually started from and is housed in a kibbutz, socialist kibbutz, is actually making this innovative capitalist product that's being sold around the world. And so all of the owners, in fact, are millionaires at this point, even though they're still living in kibbutz. Market cap about $1.6 billion, wow. And they actually have about half of the market of international pool cleaning. So they also have other products that are helping that. We also look for companies that diversify their products and services. And so they have alarm systems, they have pH checkers on the pools. They have guards so the kids don't fall in and these sorts of things. And so they're doing a great job in selling, but some of the performance we've seen on their stock is phenomenal. We've seen the last year approximately about 100% growth. We look back over the last 5 years, about 620% growth as they sell their pool cleaning.
I understand that, because you build a house, you buy a house that has a pool, you're thinking, oh, this is going to be a lot of fun, but then you end up working for your pool, right? Because you have to clean it, and you have to make sure your kids don't fall in it, and you have to. So those kind of products, I guess, are making people's life.
And actually during Corona, this is actually Corona actually helped this particular industry. People don't want to necessarily invite the pool guy by, and you're not supposed to really be close to people.
Or go to public pools, right?
Or go to public pools at all. In fact, in Israel, you couldn't for about a year. And so what they want is a system that they can control. They can determine how much they're paying their pool guy. They just buy a $500 unit, send it down every day, and overnight it cleans their pool.
That's great.
So that's one of the technologies that we really are, I've been investing for clients in, seeing lots of potential market growth there. Another one is Purion Networks. This is a high-tech company in the advertising space. So they've been able to come up with some artificial intelligence mechanisms to find clients and utilize advertising in a better way. In fact, they have a partnership, $800 million partnership with Bing, Microsoft's Bing search engine, to be able to target and find the clients that are most relevant to the businesses of the publishers that are their clients.
So it's like hyper-targeted marketing?
Exactly. So they're able to capture and see clients or users, customers, move through their websites for a lot longer than most type of advertisers are able to do. And so we see tremendous growth there. Their revenue is in the digital ad space, $340 billion today, but in even 4 years, they're going to be a $500 billion business. Their stock has gone up also in the last 3 years about 450%. And we see that their debt has shrunk from 93 million in 2016. Now they're in a positive cash space. So we see a lot of good coming into the technology spaces of Israel. Those are two companies that we've done tremendously on.
Okay, so I want to put my hard-earned money with Wise Money Israel under your investment. What would you say are the exciting things that I have to look forward to over the next 2 to 5 years?
Well, first of all, you can get started with an account of, let's say, $75,000 or more. We'll sit down, we'll talk about what sort of future you're looking for. You're looking for a lot of volatility, but a lot of upside. You're willing to take some risks, or are we looking for a more steady approach? We may want to put you, for example, in some corporate bonds with a smaller portion, for example, in stocks. To the extent that you're able to invest a little bit more risky in Israel, you'll obviously take advantage of the innovations that are going on here. We'll be able to invest you in some of these things that we've talked about today. We're looking for, like I said, a steady 10% growth per year is probably what you would expect on the stock side. As we see new IPOs,
that's not taking into account the currency inflation compared to whatever currency.
Exactly. And in any given year, of course, currency can go up, currency can go down. But as we see over the long pull, you'll benefit also from a strong currency. And we'll be able to put you into some of these new companies that are coming on board as you're investing with us. It's a discretionary management, portfolio management licensed by the Israel Securities Authority. And so we take your guidelines and we invest the way you want us to invest. So if you say, I really love banks, I want to be invested in banks, or I really don't like that sector, I'd like a lot more in some of the energy plays, whether they be alternate energy or natural gas that Israel's discovered in the last decade. These are some of the spaces that we can put you in for the long term, and you'll be happy that you're investing with your convictions, whether you be Zionist or coming from a biblical perspective, and just enjoying the fact you're part of Israel and earning a good profit at the same time.
Yeah, so as you know, many of our viewers are Christian business people from around the world, and of course Jesus said that where your money is, there your heart is also. So if people want to put their heart, connect their heart at a deeper level in Israel, I think they could start by investing their money in the Israeli Stock Exchange and these high-performing portfolios. We definitely recommend the services of Wise Money Israel. Like I said in our introduction, all of the members of the Arise community that I've referred to you have come back with just raving response. So thank you for that. Thank you for serving our community, and thank you for the positive relationship with Arise. And we really appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation, and just say more power to you with your work and what you're doing.
I appreciate you, and obviously we're part of the Arise community as well. We look forward to the next summit.
Thank you.
Arise is an alliance of people around the world who cherish the Hebrew values of improving the quality of human life and protecting human life through business in a commercially viable way. In short, we believe in doing well by doing good. And I want to invite you today to join the Arise Alliance. Once you become a member of our alliance, you'll receive quarterly gift boxes with really cool gifts from Israel that you and your family are going to love. And it's a direct way of helping small Israeli businesses that are creating fantastic products. You're going to receive exclusive access to some really exciting content, including our Hebrew Word of the Month and also our featured Business of the Month, where I go into Israeli companies and interview some entrepreneurs and business leaders that are creating amazing technologies, tackling crises facing humanity and making life better. And this will expose you to some really exciting investment opportunities. You'll also receive free access to all of our events, including the Arise Quarterly Digital Summits, which are just fantastic networking opportunities where you can connect your business to other like-minded entrepreneurs. Let's discover together what is our part to play in Tikkun Olam as we're working together to fix this world. So make sure you're joined today. Welcome to the Arise Alliance.